folks. Welcome to another episode of the Snowy's Camping Show. I'm Ben. You're joined by myself and my colleague, Lauren. If you guys haven't joined us before, then please subscribe either via our YouTube channel where you'll find these podcast episodes and a whole bunch of other product and all sorts of videos, or via your favorite podcast app. And you can join in on the conversation at the Snowy's Camping Show Facebook group, where both Lauren and I are on there, and other experts and a whole community of people who we like to just talk camping and stuff with. Now, I'm pretty excited about today's episode. We've got another special guest with us, and that's Tony from GME. How are you, Tony?
G'day, guys. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. Hey, we have just started with GME at Snowy's. At the time of filming this, I think we've had GME radios on the shelves for what?
A couple of weeks, maybe?
Yeah, two or 4 weeks, probably not more than
3
4 weeks.
months, maybe max.
And we're pretty excited to get it on board. I know I've dealt with GME a very long time ago, and there's a big gap, and I was pretty excited to see him come back on the shelf because it's an Australian-made brand, and we'll let you talk a bit more about the brand. I won't go into it too much, but give us a little bit about yourself, what's your background, and what makes you the expert in GME products?
I don't know if I call myself an expert, but definitely pretty passionate about the products and definitely about the markets that we deal with at GME. My background, I've been in consumer electronics for nearly 20 years now, and pretty into my camping, four-wheel driving, fishing, hunting, anything sort of outdoors. So for me, when I saw a job come up for GME, it was a pretty natural fit. And I suppose the rest has been history. I've been there for nearly 6 years now.
So natural progression from loving radios and all things, all the accessories for four-wheel drive into a job that you're working at every day.
Yeah, definitely. And, I've always been interested in electronics and technology, and I suppose the uniqueness of GME being an Australian manufacturer of electronics was something that really interested me. It was something completely different to what I'd experienced prior to that.
Yeah, nice. So is your car just sort of an over-engineered UHF radio? Like, have you just got, is it one of those cars that have just got aerials all over the bull bars and just totally over the top?
Of course. So I've got an 80 series Land Cruiser,
Nice.
which is actually a GME branded vehicle that we use for some promos, and we take to shows, and we do a lot of content trips and filming with it. And yes, it's got quite a few antennas on it. UHF, cellular, AM, FM, because all the standard ones get broken off in the bush. So yeah, it looks like a porcupine.
So do you have a bit of a laugh at other cars that you see around, thinking you've just got that for the look, mate? You don't really need it, or do you reckon?
We love those people.
Love them.
That's all right. Hey, it's got to be functional, but it's also got to look cool, right? That's the laws of four-wheel driving.
Bigger aerials, the better. Hey, I think there's even a bigger one than this. You've got this is one of your I forget the name of the type of aerial. The thicker ones that you've got, but I reckon you've got like what's the longest version of that?
In UHF, 2.1 meters.
2.1 meters. That's a big aerial. You're going to that's going to take out the rafters in a car park.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go on, Tony. That's fine.
I was just going to say those large antennas often double as flagpoles for the BNS Ute Brigade, so they're dual purpose, you can say.
Actually, that's a good one. I'll ask that later. Let's stick to the schedule.
About the BNS Brigade? Is that where you're getting more questions?
No. I've got nothing to do with BNS. It's about the aerials and the flags, but I'll just make a mental note of that. Let's ask more about GME, the company. Now, we had to ask the other day what GME stood for, because we didn't actually know. We couldn't find it anywhere, but you gave us the answer. So can we let everyone know what GME stands for?
Yeah, it's something that we get asked pretty frequently, and it's always good to hear what people's guesses are. It actually stands for Greenwich Marine Electronics, and the business has been around for a really long time. So we've been trading as Standard Communications, which is our parent company, for 62 years.
Oh, wow.
And through the progression, we actually started with marine radios well before we got into UHF radios. And that Greenwich Marine is obviously related to Greenwich Mean Time, which is a standard in the marine industry. And the business has evolved. We've, started catering to different markets, but the name has stuck. And of course, now that GME brand is so well recognised that we're definitely not going to be changing it.
Yeah, nice. It's got a nice ring to it. So do you just keep the actual meaning secret? You don't advertise it anywhere just to see how many funny guesses come through?
Look, it's a funny one. We haven't published it anywhere, but not for any particular reason.
Yeah, right.
Really, because it takes a bit of explaining. A lot of people don't understand, well, what's it got to do with marine electronics if all they're used to from GME is UHF radios.
Okay.
But, we've got a long history and we're quite proud of that history, so it's definitely not a secret.
All right. Can I borrow your pen, Lauren? Because I've got questions that are coming into my mind as I'm talking here, and I forgot my pen today.
It's all right. I'm prepared.
You take over while I
So what was behind the progression from marine communications into land-based communications? Was it sort of like a market-driven, or was there a need for it? Do you know by any chance?
Yeah, definitely. So the company was actually founded in 1959. In our founder Ted Dunn's backyard shed, and he was repairing TV tuners. So it had absolutely nothing to do with radio comms at the time.
Yeah, right.
But our founder Ted had a really good knack for identifying niche markets and then sourcing or developing products to suit. And the UHF category was a really interesting one. In the 1980s, the product started to become really relevant, particularly in the farming community, because farmers need comms. This is well before mobile phones, of course.
Yeah.
And when you're out in the field and you need communication, even back to your homestead, there was no alternative. So, there was AM radios and all those sorts of things that had limitations. And UHF really started to gain some traction. And Ted, at the time, identified that opportunity and started to develop some products. And I suppose you could say the rest is history.
Nice. So when you say AM and UHF, AM, is that the old, 27 meg radio? Is that what AM is?
Yeah, 27 meg and SSB. And there's a whole raft of different types of two-way communication. But really, without getting too technical, it's just different frequencies and different waveforms that the different radios run on.
So did GME start with UHF or did you have some radios in that older sort of technology as well?
We were doing 27 megahertz marine radios before we moved into UHF.
Oh, righto. Okay.
So AM CB.
Right. Okay.
And you guys don't just deal in radios either, do you?
Look, that's a good question. Not radios exclusively, but every product that GME offers is a radio communication product in some form or other. So it's all RF. So the majority of our business now is UHF CB radios, emergency beacons, so EPIRBs and PLBs, and marine communication, so VHF radios for the marine market. And, of course, all of the associated antennas to suit the different types of radio. We also have a commercial radio division, which is private frequency communication, licensed, requiring an operator's license and private frequencies. And then the last section of our business is what's known as Kingrate, which is, I guess, probably the closest thing to what we started, and that is TV signal distribution systems. So we've got quite a few different product categories within the mix, but the thing that underpins all of them is that it's all RF based.
Right. Okay. I didn't actually realize it was that broad. You've obviously done some research.
I just knew about PLBs and stuff, not about the rest of it.
Yeah. I did have a GME PLB a long time ago.
But, that was awesome.
I've got more technical questions, but I just want to touch on first before we go any further. Australian made. It's a topic we love to talk about here. It's quite a big topic on Australian made or Australian companies who make overseas. But the big thing for us is in some way we're supporting Australian companies. You guys, is everything made in Australia? I'm assuming you must get some stuff from overseas and assemble here. But how can people sort of view what level of Australian made GME is?
Sure. It's a good question, and it's one that we do get asked quite often.
Yep.
So we're a 100% Australian-owned business. We're still family-owned, and the main priority for us as a business is that we can continue to manufacture product in Australia. Now, of course, there's challenges with that. The labour costs here are much higher than overseas, and there's no semiconductor manufacturers in Australia, for example. So components absolutely come from all over the world, but we are committed to Australian manufacturing. And the easiest way for us to describe how much of our product is on a revenue basis. So in excess of 80% of our yearly revenue comes from Australian manufactured product built in our factory in Winston Hills in Sydney, Australia.
That's cool to know, because I think a lot of people jump out there and just think I want all Australian made, but there's massive limitations to that. Like you say, the superconductors or that conductor you mentioned, if it's just not made in Australia. So and without that, I'm assuming you can't make your product. So yeah, there's got to be a percentage somewhere that is a happy medium for quality and price as well.
Absolutely.
So have you got more Australian made questions?
No, I'm good.
You're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Right.
I'm just quietly sitting here because I literally know nothing about radios except for the fact that they give me some peace and quiet with my kids off in the bush with them when I go camping, but that's about the limit. So I'm just happily observing you lead this one.
I'm probably armed with a heap of questions because I did a lot of research recently going, should I upgrade my 40-channel radio? So given I've brought it up, let's ask that question. I think, was it 2019 maybe? There was earlier than that, I think possibly a change to an 80-channel system. And I think initially 40-channel radios were going to be illegal, but then that was overturned. And now you can use a 40 and an 80 or something. I don't know. I've just read this on forums, so what I'm saying may be completely left field. So it'd be nice to hear from you how that transition is. And people who've got a 40-channel radio who maybe use it occasionally, should they upgrade, and what are the limitations if they don't?
All right, there's a few parts to that, and I'll start with the one that I don't know the answer to, which is exactly when the 40 to 80 channel cutover occurred. But I think it was about 10 years ago now. It's quite some time ago.
Okay.
Now, 40 channel radios will still work, but of course, you're only getting half the picture, right?
Mm.
If everyone in your convoy is running an 80 channel radio and you're on a 40, well, there's 40 channels that you're not going to have access to. So if the group needs to move to one of those channels, you're just quite simply not going to hear them. The ACMA, or the Communications Authority of Australia, who mandate and manage all of the spectrum, which includes obviously UHF Radio, originally decided that they were going to make 40-channel radios illegal. And then based on a large amount of feedback from industry and from the market, they decided that they wouldn't actually make the products illegal, but they strongly recommend that people do use an 80-channel radio wherever possible so they get the full benefit of that 80-channel UHF CB picture.
Okay.
Why would you make 40-channel illegal? Like, what's the motivation behind that?
I think it was intended to try and encourage the market to move up to that 80-channel product. But, a lot of people would say, well, my 40-channel radio works, so why do I need to upgrade it? And I think ultimately that's what drove the ACMA to say, well, we'll leave it up to the discretion of each individual user whether they would like to upgrade or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of industry too that said, well, I've now got, 50, 100 trucks all with a 40-channel radio.
Yeah.
And you're going to force me now to go and buy, 50 to 100 new radios, which is an expensive thing for me. So I think,
suppose if they're also out of production, they will just phase out naturally anyway.
I guess a bit like me. I've just upgraded.
Oh, I was a bit like you phased out naturally.
No, I'm not phased out. I upgraded.
Yeah, exactly. You've upgraded.
All right. So I guess probably to answer the question of people trying to answer, if they're asking themselves that question, I guess if you use it occasionally and you've only got one other friend and you can pick a channel that you both communicate on within that 40 channels, it's fine. But if you are traveling on the open road and you want the full gamut of keeping track of what's going on the highway, dangers, more channels to like safety channels, then you want to upgrade to that 80 because otherwise you're only getting 50% of the potential, I guess.
So
yeah, that's right. And sorry to cut you off there, but I think the other thing that people have got to take into account is there's a lot more to UHF than just the number of channels. So whilst a 40-channel radio will still work, the technology has evolved so much over the last 10 years that there's so many other features and benefits to a current radio that you're missing out on if you're still using a 10, 15, 20-year-old radio. And we know that that's the case. That people, these devices last for a very long time, and people are quite happy to continue using it because, hey, if it still works, why do I need to upgrade? And that's something that we hear quite often.
Do you know what I do love though? And I will mention this, that my thought, I've got to get a new radio. That means I've got to find a weekend to, rewire it and install it. But I didn't have to because it's all plug and play. It's the same power plug and everything. I pulled the old one out, plugged the power in. It's all fused and everything. Plugged the existing aerial in, and I just put a new bracket on the dash, and it was good to go. So that's after about 12 years, my old radio, and it was plug and play. Anyway,
awesome.
That was cool.
Why UHF Radio ultimately? Because a lot of people who maybe have made it this far in the podcast who don't have a radio maybe are wondering, well, why would I actually need one? Like, why is this podcast going to be relevant to me? So if you're someone who's just a car camper or you're getting into four-wheel drive touring and things like that, why should you consider having a UHF radio?
It's a really simple question to answer that one. And it's really what the whole UHF category means, and that is communication without infrastructure. So quite simply, as soon as you get outside of major metro centres, you'll know that your mobile phone reception is patchy or maybe non-existent. And if you want to communicate out there efficiently and effectively, you need an alternate means to a mobile phone. So that's where UHF obviously becomes so relevant. And then taking it a little bit further from a safety aspect, if you need to communicate in the event of an emergency and you're solely relying on your mobile phone, that creates issues. And what a lot of people don't know is that in Australia, only 14% of our entire land mass is covered with mobile phone.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So you don't have to go very far out of a major city to all of a sudden realise that you can't rely on your mobile phone.
I had no idea. I would have thought it was way more than that.
It's tiny, isn't it?
I would have thought like more than 50%.
Yeah, if I had to pull a figure out of the air, I would have said that too. So sorry, you're right, Tony.
There's 7 million square kilometres of land mass in this country, and less than 1 million of it has mobile phone reception.
I should be writing these figures down just to make me sound smarter next time someone asks about the size of Australia. There are some limitations, so like a UHF, and we'll get a little bit onto aerials later, but there's it's not like if you're driving, driven from Adelaide and you've got out of phone reception, you're not going to be able to contact someone in Darwin. Like there's a limitation, and when we talk about communication, if something happens, you're trying to communicate to someone within kind of the range of your radio, I suppose. So you're giving yourself an opportunity just to jump on the radio and say, is anyone there? Or jumping on a scan and jumping on a channel where there is activity to try and call for help. That's
correct. So as with all two-way communication, UHF CB is line of sight.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on a vast number of factors, your transmission power, the size of your aerial, and the geographic nature of the area that you're in is actually the biggest factor.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a particularly mountainous area, that's going to drop your maximum potential transmission range quite significantly because of those obstructions. If you're out on a hay plain, for example, and you can see forever, you're going to get much greater distance out of the radio. But the thing that you've got to keep in mind is we estimate there are close to 3 million UHF radios in commission in Australia at any one time. So the likelihood of you being able to pick someone up or make a call on one of the dedicated emergency channels that someone in the area may be monitoring is pretty good. We don't think for a second, though, that UHF is the be-all and end-all of communication, particularly from an emergency perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you start to look at things like emergency beacons, which are that extra level of safety and, I suppose, insurance above a UHF radio if things really do take a turn for the worse.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a possible alternative consideration to a satellite phone, for example. Like some people are like, well, I don't want to purchase a satellite phone and have to sort of pay for an extra SIM card and things like that. So having a UHF CB radio that has a decent range would be a good alternative.
Look, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't say that it's a direct alternative, but I think they're quite complementary. So a satellite phone obviously is a really powerful device that'll work anywhere on the planet, but the purchase price is quite high and you've got those ongoing subscriptions that you're paying for whether you're using the device or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then in a lot of cases you're paying per call or per message. A UHF radio, you buy it once and then it's free to use forever. And it's an open communication platform. So you can put a call out on a UHF and anyone within range on that channel will be able to hear you, as opposed to a satellite phone where you need to be calling a specific person.
Mm-hmm.
So they're quite different devices, and I think for a lot of serious remote travellers, you'll find that they will have both. They'll have a UHF radio in the car and they'll also have a sat phone. And for some of those particularly safety-conscious people, they might have an emergency beacon as well.
Mm-hmm.
So really covering all of those bases. And I suppose the more remote you go, and particularly if you're travelling by yourself, you can never have too many safety devices when it comes to comms.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I know for me, I have the radio, and it's a bit like a first aid kit, I suppose. It's the first point of call. If I'm not in in significant danger, it's something that I can, sit out and wait for someone to come nearby and try and call for help. But if things become dire, I've got a P or B, which I can then use to call for help. But that's only once I've, no, I can't get anyone.
Yeah,
can't get help.
No
I need help now.
Mm.
So whereas a sat phone, you can dial into anywhere in the world. I suppose call anywhere in the world if you like at a significant cost. So yeah.
So what kind of UHF CB? Well, okay, first question: why are we saying UHF CB and not UHF?
Okay, so that's probably because I'm in the industry. So for the vast majority of, our customers, they just call it a UHF, and a UHF is a UHF. The reason that I call it a UHF CB is because these particular radios operate on the citizen band. So that's anyone can use it. When we talk about commercial radio, which we also develop products for the commercial radio market, they have UHF and VHF. But they're not citizen band. So they're still operating in the same frequencies, but they're licensed channels. So they're not those open public 80 CB channels. They're individually licensed frequencies, so that if you decide to purchase one of those frequencies or license the frequency from the ACMA, you can have private communication on that channel and nobody else will be able to hear you.
Okay.
So UHF by default is citizen band. VHF is a licensed channel?
Not exactly, no. So it's down to the frequency. So UHF is ultra high frequency.
Yep.
And within the ultra high frequency, there's CB and commercial.
Right. So each channel.
Same frequencies, different channels.
So so that UHF CB is 80 channels that are tuned within that CB range, but then you can have the commercial side of it. That is those 40 channels tuned within the commercial range. Can they then talk to each other as well?
No.
Okay. All right.
So there are commercial radios that feature CB channels, and there are CB radios that can hear commercial radios but can't transmit on those channels. Okay. So it gets a little bit confusing, but there is a difference between a UHF commercial radio and a UHF CB radio, absolutely.
Okay. So I guess if you're talking police and emergency services, they're using a commercial channel because they don't want, average Joe and driving down the highway interfering.
Well, in a lot of cases, they're using completely different technology. So they're using encrypted digital radio.
Right.
So within, radio is radio. There's many different types of product depending on the requirements. So, of course, the police, some of the sensitive things that they speak about, they don't want people being able to tap in and listen. Gone are the days where you could sit in your living room with a scanner and listen to what the local police are doing. All of the communication, especially in the metro areas of Australia, is all encrypted digital now, so nobody can hear what's being said.
And VHF then, so you talked about, you started with marine, so there's marine and there's UHF. So marine is a VHF channel?
Yeah, that's right.
And so can you use a UHF in a boat?
This is an interesting one. So practically, yes, you can. So a VHF marine radio will work on land and a UHF CB radio will work on water.
Okay.
However, they're not intended for that use.
Okay.
So UHF CB is intended for terrestrial use and VHF marine is, funnily enough, it's designed for use in the marine environment. So wherever possible, we recommend that people buy the correct product as they're intended to be used. And there's some differences between UHF and VHF aside from the frequencies. So as an example, in Australia, we're limited to 5-watt transmission power on UHF. As a manufacturer, we're not allowed to offer a product for sale that transmits more than 5 watt. In VHF Marine, we're allowed to transmit 25 watt, which obviously gives us much greater range. So there are specific benefits to the different types of product designed around those standards.
Right. So a forward driver getting a VHF is going to talk about having a 25 watt radio, and he can talk about all the boats and talk to all the boats in the harbour, but none of the other forward drivers on the road.
Spot on.
Right.
So taking it back, what sort of variety, or what are my words are all tangled up
Jumbled
here
today.
What kinds of UHF CB radios are available for your average forward drive tourer camper?
There's a lot of them. But really you can define it as there's two separate types of UHF CB radio. One is a handheld, which is also known as a portable, and the other is a fixed mount, which is also known as a mobile. And quite simply, the handheld radio is portable. Quite literally, it's a portable radio.
Yep.
And when it comes to a fixed mount radio, it's installed in a vehicle and it is mobile because the vehicle's mobile. So that's really quite, to simplify it.
Yep.
And then within those two categories, there's different transmission power, different features, waterproof radios, radios with GPS, radios with Bluetooth, and that's where you start getting, quite detailed in terms of the specific features that you need for your usage.
Because your Lotus radio's got some pretty cool tech in there. I think there's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and all this stuff that I looked at recently and went, I thought it was just UHF radio, and now there's all this technology in a radio now. So it's quite. Some of those newer models are pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there sort of like a basic or a one-size-fits-all UHF radio for people who are camping or starting to do a bit longer trips, nothing too crazy, but that they could invest in that would probably cover them for most of what they're going to do that isn't on sort of extreme ends?
I suppose there is. If someone's an infrequent user, but they still want to have UHF comms for those times when they are outside of those metro areas, we recommend everybody starts with a handheld radio at a minimum. Mm-hmm. They're super convenient. You can use it in the vehicle. And obviously, if you get into camp, you can use it outside of the vehicle. You can still monitor, traffic on those channels, but you don't have the investment of a fixed mount radio and an antenna, and you don't obviously have to install it in your vehicle. The limitation with a handheld, of course, is around your range because you've only got a very small antenna on the top of the radio. And, of course, because it's battery powered, you've got to make sure that the battery's always charged, as opposed to a fixed mount radio, which is running off your 12-volt system in your vehicle. So you get much longer run times.
Okay.
So a 5-watt handheld has a small aerial versus a 5-watt fixed radio with one of these aerials here. Even though they're both 5-watt, the aerial determines the range. Is that right?
Yes. It's a combination of factors, but absolutely. And it comes back to the line of sight that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. So the taller your antenna is, just by default, you're going to be able to transmit further because the antenna is higher. Okay. And it's actually a good point. It also comes down to where that antenna is mounted on the vehicle. Mm-hmm. So we often see, particularly with the Jeep owners, they mount their antennas on the back of the vehicle, and that will automatically drop the available range that antenna will be able to transmit on. So the more that the antenna is unobstructed out on the front of the bull bar or on top of the roof are actually the two best places to ensure you're going to get the maximum transmission out of your radio.
So you kind of want a flat plane around the base of the radio is what you're saying there. So the Jeep is sort of mounted up against the back of the car, and is that the limitation?
It's not so much the plane. That used to be a consideration when all of the antennas were what's called ground dependent, and they required that ground plane or that flat surface in order to operate effectively. The majority of the antennas that we offer now are ground independent, so they don't require that ground plane, but it really comes down to obstruction. And you've got to think, if an antenna is vertically mounted right up against the flat back wall of a Jeep, then it's going to struggle to transmit a signal through that big lump of metal by the vehicle, as opposed to being somewhere where there's no obstructions and there's clear air around that antenna.
Is there just some handy place to mount the aerial on a Jeep? Is that you've labelled that one car, but is that the brand that you see?
I don't know what it is, but we see it on Jeep Wranglers all the time on the back. I think, there's maybe one of the influential people in the Jeep world put their antenna there, and now everyone thinks it's a great idea.
Does it look cool? Maybe it just looks cool.
Well, there is a practical element to it, and that is that a lot of people don't like having antennas on their bull bar because they find it distracting having a big, black aerial on the front of the vehicle. Now, I'm not one of those people. I've got two big black antennas on the front of my bull bar, and to be honest, I'm pretty used to it now. Yeah. I don't notice them there, but that is a reason. But you've got to weigh up. Sure, it might not be, convenient having an antenna mounted on the front of your vehicle because it could be distracting, or your passenger might not like it. But it depends how well you'd like your radio to work. So it's all about concessions and making sure that you put it in the best possible place to give you the best performance.
Okay. All right.
Talking about range and wattage and all of that sort of stuff, some other brands seem to be happy to state a rough kilometre range for each of their radios, and it does seem to be, 1 watt, 2 watt, 5 watt. The range sort of increases incrementally. But I noticed you guys don't do that. And since we've started stocking your range, probably one of the most common questions is, how much range am I going to get out of this handheld radio? Is there sort of like a bit of a rule of thumb with wattages versus range, or is it not that simple?
It's not that simple, unfortunately. There's far too many variables, and I touched on a few of them earlier. Geographic conditions are one of the biggest impacts on range. So if you're on the top of a mountain, you're going to get great transmission distance. If you're down in a valley, your transmission distance is going to be greatly reduced. So yes, some other manufacturers put a claim saying this radio will transmit 17 kilometers, but it can be seen as a little bit misleading in some ways, because if the customer then has that expectation that the radio will transmit 17 kilometers in all conditions, then they're going to end up being quite disappointed if they say, well, I know that, my friend was 6 kilometers away and they couldn't hear me. This radio doesn't work. Well, no, that's not necessarily correct. There's too many other factors. So as a general rule, GME will not make a claim in terms of this radio will transmit X number of kilometers. Broadly speaking, a 5-watt handheld radio, there are in ideal conditions, could give you up to 10 kilometers of range.
Okay. All right.
A fixed mount radio transmitting 5-watt could give you up to 25 kilometers of range, or maybe even more. But again, it comes back to those variables.
Yeah.
And then you add UHF CB repeaters into the mix, and that range can be greatly extended, 150, 200 kilometers. So I think without trying to confuse everybody with the technicalities of it, we would rather say this is what the transmission power of the radio is and make no claim as to the effective range of that particular product.
So
makes perfect sense.
Why would somebody choose a 1-watt handheld over a 5-watt handheld, or vice versa?
Price is definitely a consideration for a lot of people, and also the use case. So if you're in a convoy and you can see the other vehicles that you're traveling with at all times, then a 1-watt handheld will do the job perfectly. You don't need to be transmitting 10, 15, 20 kilometers if everyone in your group that you want to talk to is within 500 meters. Similarly, if you mentioned earlier just wanting to stay in touch with the kids around camp, then a 1-watt handheld will do the job fine. And there's also a somewhat hidden benefit, and that is not for you, but for everybody else in the campsite who won't have to listen to your children screaming and squawking on the UHF if their transmission distance is limited by the available power in the radio.
That is actually quite true. Because admittedly, I did mention before that I had sort of a more entry-level radio set earlier on in the piece, and I'll need to replace some of them. And I was looking like 1 watt, 2 watt, 5 watt, which one is going to mean my kids can go further away from me? But so what you're saying is that doesn't actually come down to that.
No, not always. And, again, it really comes down to the specific use case. If you're going to be doing a lot of remote travel and you're going to be by yourself, then, of course, you'd like, the maximum transmission power and a really high quality, high performance aerial to make sure that you're going to get the maximum transmission out of your radio.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just looking for figures so you can dump the kids 10 Ks up the river and then drive back and have a peaceful camp. Is that what you're looking for? I wouldn't. Sometimes I really do feel like I would like to do that, but I actually wouldn't. But I think, part of being a kid and growing up in a family that camps and adventures and things like that, you want to be able to, or as a parent of those kids as well, you want to be able to equip them with the things that they need to be a bit more autonomous and start having their own adventures and things like that. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking, if I'm going to invest some money, what's going to be the best bet of making sure that they can go
as far as they feel comfortable to go and still be within safety. So, does that sort of make sense? I'm not trying to get rid of them, but I'm trying to encourage and support their independence in adventuring.
Let's move on to antennas. This is where it could get pretty technical with antennas because there's short ones. People want the big ones because they look good, but they're not always the best scenario. But is there a way to kind of simplify for those who have no idea how an antenna works? Like, does it just send this beam of radio wave, or is the radio waves going out in this kind of massive kind of ball shape, or like, is there a visual way that people can understand how an antenna transmits a radio wave?
It absolutely is. And this is a super technical topic, which is far above my level of technical understanding. But we can simplify it for the vast majority of users. And the way that you have to think about the way that radio waves are transmitted through an antenna is what's called a radiation pattern. So the way that the signal comes out of the radio into the antenna and then obviously gets transmitted out. And the way that you measure how those different antennas transmit the different radiation is in gain, which is in a measurement of dBi. So you'll see 2.1 dBi antennas, 6.6 dBi, 8.1 dBi. And usually the length of the antenna correlates with that number in terms of gain. So lower gain is generally a shorter antenna. So a 2.1 dBi antenna might be 400 mil long, for example. An 8.1 dBi antenna could be 2.1 meters long. Now, you might think, well, the higher gain, the better it's going to be, right? Not the case. So whilst some people think, well, I need the biggest possible antenna because it's going to give me the best performance, as the antenna gain increases, the radiation pattern changes shape. So if you were to imagine a balloon full of air, it's quite round, that could be seen as a 2.1 dBi radiation pattern. So it'll transmit quite broadly, but over a smaller distance. Mm-hmm. As the gain increases, imagine putting pressure on that balloon. And as you put pressure on the balloon, it squeezes and it gets longer. Mm-hmm. So an 8.1 dBi antenna will transmit further than a 2.1 dBi antenna, but it will transmit in a flatter radiation pattern. So it comes back to those geographic conditions. Mm. If you're in hilly or mountainous terrain and you're running an 8.1 dBi antenna, your range probably won't be that good because the signal is not going to be able to overcome those obstructions. So it comes down to the type of terrain that you're in as to the best performing antenna. So a lot of the antennas in our range actually have interchangeable whips so that you can change the whip to suit the varying conditions. So if you're going up into the Victorian high country, for example, you switch to a smaller, shorter whip with lower gain, which will give you better performance in the hills. And then if you're going out across the Nullarbor, you change that whip to a longer antenna with a higher gain, and it's going to give you much greater transmission distance.
I'm assuming the whip is the little bit that is like an actual whip, like the physical thing you screw on and off.
The stick.
The stick.
So we've got some GME radios conveniently placed right here. But this, to explain to people, the whip in this instance, well, I've got this area here, right? So the whip is this fiberglass bit on top here, and then this is the little bit that makes it ground independent. Is that right?
That's
Can
correct.
you even see
That's
what I'm pointing at?
Elevated feed is what that thing is called.
Okay. And then there's a spring on the base, and that's there to kind of allow it to, not break on corrugated rows and things. So there's three elements to this. So this bit on top here, I don't know if this is our demo one, so I don't know if actually unscrew. I won't take it. Well, that one's probably not interchangeable with these ones, but if you've got various sizes, so this is a 2.1, and then I'm not sure what that one is, but these are interchangeable. 6.6.
Yeah.
So you can have this base and you can switch between these two depending on which terrain. So if you're going from the Victorian high country to the Hay Plains, you can switch from the short one in the high country because you're going to get
which is for distance. People who are listening and not watching us on YouTube, it's about maybe a foot long.
Yeah, probably about a foot long, yeah. And you're going to have better communication over hills and through trees and valleys and all that sort of stuff. But when you get to the flats, you're still going to have a shorter range, but you're still going to be able to use this one. But if you want longer range, you can switch to the longer aerial.
Which is about 3 foot.
About
maybe?
4 foot.
Do you reckon? 3?
3
I'd
foot,
say
maybe.
3 foot, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1,200 millimeters.
Oh, there you
I don't know
go.
what that
All
is
the details.
in Imperial.
And this one here. So I think you covered off most of our questions really well in that last question, but the ground independent versus non-ground independent. So is this one here, that's not ground independent?
All of the antennas that you've got on that display there are ground independent.
Okay, so it means there's something at the base here that probably technical to get into, but when would someone, for the most part, people want a ground independent aerial because they can mount it in most places on their vehicle. Mm-hmm. In what instance do people not need a ground independent aerial?
If they're willing to drill a hole in the center of their roof.
Okay. So, or bonnet.
Look, I'm being, probably a little bit glib about that, but I think a ground-dependent antenna is seen as older technology now. As the technology's evolved, we've worked out ways to make the antennas ground-independent, which gives you far greater flexibility in terms of where you're mounting the antenna. Because, well, back in the 80s, if you wanted the optimal performance out of a UHF, you were literally drilling a hole in the center of the roof turret of your vehicle and installing the antenna there.
Right.
And the antenna is using the roof as the ground plane to operate effectively.
Okay. So I guess if someone's setting up in a shed or something and they just want to put it in the roof of the shed, they don't need this ground independent element to it. So is it going to be too technical to ask how this makes it ground independent?
It's probably going to be hard for me to explain.
Okay, let's leave that.
Yeah.
I'm just feeding my own curiosity there, I think. I've answered most of my questions. Oh, my flagpole question.
Your flagpole question.
So my thought would be if I got this and went, I've got a 2.1, whatever, 2.2, your long area, I'm going to use it as a flagpole and it breaks. Do you guys go, no, you can't use it as a flagpole, mate? It's not covered under warranty. But you're saying you can actually use it as a flagpole?
Look, it's not something that we specify. It's definitely not in the instruction manual on how to turn your antenna into a flagpole. But look, we do know that the B&S community enjoy having some flags on their vehicles and having two big antennas on the front. It's I guess it's too tempting not to use them as a flagpole.
Right.
With that said, those particular antennas do have a really heavy-duty spring base on them, as you probably would have seen on that display. So a flag on the top of it while it's parked in a field is probably not going to cause it any harm.
And it doesn't affect the how the aerial operates to have a flag attached to it?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge.
Because I have one of these areas, my little rubber cap came off the end and I've just stuck a little rubber cap that I found in my shed on the end and I thought, I wonder if that affects the how the aerial works.
No, not at all.
But that's probably me just overthinking things again.
Is there any such thing as a hybrid between a fixed mount and a handheld?
Oh, good question. Yes, there's a couple of different options. So with the handheld radios, you can buy drop-in chargers that you can mount in your vehicle. Mm. And you can also unscrew the antenna from those handhelds and screw in a small magnetic antenna, which you can put on the roof of your vehicle. So you can then turn your handheld into a pseudo fixed mount radio. Still not going to be quite the same in terms of you're not going to be able to put those really large antennas, those 6.6 dB high gain antennas on them, but it will give you better range simply by having the antenna outside of the vehicle as opposed to inside. And it comes back to those obstructions and placement of the antennas. So you can see here there's a common theme through all of this, right? Yeah. So the best possible scenario is that your antenna is free of obstructions, higher and, outside of the vehicle. The other option that we have is what's called a plug-and-play radio. Now, this is a fixed-mount radio, but one that doesn't require permanent installation in the vehicle. So we supply that with a 12-volt DC, I don't know what you're meant to call them, that's politically correct, but a cigarette lighter socket is what I know them as.
Yep.
Plug that in and, again, runs that small magnetic antenna. So you can still have the benefits of fixed-mount radio, but, again, you're going to be limited by the antenna.
Okay. This is going to be a really stupid question. Okay. Don't laugh at me. But you know how sometimes if you have Wi-Fi devices that, I don't know how I'm going to word this. If you have a really large fixed mount radio in your car and you have other smaller handheld radios around, is Is there some sort of invisible radio connection thing where your handheld radio is going to be boosted by your huge big fixed mount aerial sitting not far from you? Like, I know that might see
I'm
you
going to place bets on that question and think Tony's got no idea what you're talking about.
No, I do understand what you're asking, and unfortunately, no, that one doesn't.
All right, no
The
worries.
antenna needs to be directly connected to the radio for it to form any sort of relationship. But I think I could probably answer that question in a slightly different way, and it's something that we know comes up from time to time, and that is regarding interference. Mm-hmm. So one of the main things that we encounter is people call us and say, I bought this radio from you and it doesn't work. And we then go through that troubleshooting process, and invariably there's no issue with the radio. But the radios are quite sensitive and they do pick up radio waves, funnily enough. Mm. What people don't often take into account is the types of other products that generate noise. Things like LED light bars. Mm. So if you put your antenna very close to an LED light bar, not all of them, but some of them, will then create interference, which is heard through the radio. So when you're installing an antenna on a vehicle, it's quite important that you consider where you're going to run the antenna cable so that it's not bundled up next to power cables for other devices such as LED light bars. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to start a fight with the LED light bar industry here, but it is one that we commonly hear. And then when we simply get the customer to reroute that antenna cable away from those devices, the problem goes away.
Yeah, right. Interesting. Uh-huh. That's a good thing to consider.
We probably need to wrap up soon because I think our producer's going, it's been ages, but I do want to ask about the little stick-on aerials that you've got. That's obviously if people don't have a bull bar or don't want to drill a hole in their roof, you've got little stick-on aerials that go in the windscreen or window, I'm not sure, wherever they can be installed. What is that? Are they good? Are they really kind of a last resort if you really don't have another aerial place to install an aerial? Do they work as well?
Look, again, it comes back to that same thing, right? Where is the antenna mounted? How long is it? How much gain it has?
Right.
So in our on-glass antenna range, we've got two options. We've got a 2.1 and a 4.5. Mm-hmm. So when I say that, 4.5 dBi. So that's the amount of gain.
Yep.
Now, those antennas will still transmit and receive, but they're not going to be as effective as a 1,200 millimeter long antenna mounted on your bull bar. But for some people, again, who don't want the big black stick on the front of the car or potentially are only communicating over short distances in a convoy kind of scenario, then the on-glass antenna is a perfect solution.
Nice. I think it's another long episode,
today,
but I think we'll wrap it up. That's been really good. I've fed my own personal need for questions and knowledge, and hopefully our listeners have tuned in too. But we really appreciate that, Tony. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm sure all of our listeners will have appreciated it as well.
Not a problem at all, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, that's it for another episode. If you have any questions or if you want to join in on the conversation on GME Radios or anything that we've talked about in previous episodes, jump on the Snowy's Camping Show Facebook group. If you haven't joined, ask to join. If you've got any questions for Tony, let us know. We'll see if we can get him to answer those if we can't already answer them. And also don't forget to subscribe either via YouTube or your favourite podcast app. And that's it for today. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Catch you later.
See ya.